Our first article will be presented by Adi Pattabhiramaiah from the Georgia Institute of Technology and S. Sriram from the University of Michigan. Adi and Sriram, thank you both for joining us.
Well, thanks a lot, Paige. This is Sriram here, and thanks to JM for giving us the opportunity to discuss this paper in this webinar. As Paige said, this is a joint work with Adi from Georgia Tech and my colleague Puneet Manchanda. So I guess some of you are wondering what this paywall thing actually is. Right? And broadly speaking, a paywall is a restriction imposed by an online platform on what or how much content can be accessed by users for free. So for example, in April 2011, the New York Times introduced a paywall where users could access up to 20 articles for free. If you need to access more than 20 articles, you have to pay a fee. So this is kind of what we want to study in this paper, because at the time when New York Times introduced its paywall in 2011, the idea of making users pay for online access was relatively new. And that is what kind of got us interested in this idea. As you know, a lot of newspapers today do have paywalls, but still, we are still unclear as to what the effect of charging users or paying for access to news content actually is. So broadly speaking, firms are grappling with the need to monetize online content. It is not just restricted to online newspapers. You have things like TV channels like ESPN and HBO, which are trying to set up their own offline free access or pay for access portals where people can access content exclusively from their websites. And the question is, why is this happening? And if our experience speaks for itself, we spend a lot more time on our mobile devices. And as a result, the amount of time we spend on traditional media platforms like television, radio, and print newspapers has gone down considerably. So, and this is the primary reason why monetizing digital content is something very, very important topic to consider. So there are three broad avenues for monetizing online content. The first one is to make users pay for access to online content. And if you think about platforms like Netflix, this is exactly what they do. The only source of revenue they have is the subscription fees they get from users. A second avenue for monetization is to not make users pay for content, access to content, but actually monetize it by using advertising revenues. And the newspapers, online newspapers we had many years ago, or until even some newspapers recently, have this kind of model where you can access content for free, and the newspaper or the portal monetizes this by using advertising revenue. The third approach is more of a hybrid model where the portal gets revenues both from users as well as from advertising. In fact, the paywalls that we're considering today is exactly this model where the New York Times has advertising revenues coming in and also has users paying for access to content. So if you look at the migration that has happened in recent years, is that newspapers which are traditionally advertising supported platforms are migrating towards a more hybrid model where they're also making users pay for content. So as of today, about 75% of daily newspapers have some kind of a paywall in effect. So the big question is, when you move from a free user access model to a hybrid model where you impose a paywall, what happens? And this is exactly the point that Adi is going to walk us through in the next few minutes. Adi, I guess you can take over from here.
Thanks, Sriram. So the conventional view about paywalls is that there are lucrative additional source of untapped revenues, which in the case of newspapers can really help boost revenues. On the other hand, it's unclear how this may play out, especially because paywalls may drive away readers, especially the more active readers who tended to consume more news articles on the website and are, as a result, probably more likely to encounter the paywall in the first place. There is an additional point about equity regarding the types of users also. So a paywall can result in penalizing active or loyal readers as opposed to rewarding them. What does a paywall do to digital engagement? This has big implications because advertising is linked to traffic and engagement for newspapers. On the other hand, the possible upside is that if paywalls can drive an increase in engagement, this can help improve the quality of advertising impressions on the website as well. But this really depends on the engagement of subscribing readers, which isn't necessarily clear. Does the act of subscribing really lead to readers being more engaged with the website? That brings us to our research objective here. Here we try to assess the impact of the paywall on three important dimensions. First, the effect of digital subscription revenues, which we call the direct effect. Second, the effect on online reader engagement, or the engagement effect, which can have implications for how the newspaper can monetize advertising. And third, the effect that the paywall has on print newspaper readership, which we term the spillover effect. We examined this in the context of the paywall commissioned by the New York Times, which has been lauded as an example of a successful paywall implementation in the newspaper industry. Our analysis window is from January 2010 to June 2013, which is approximately 15 months before and after the New York Times set up its paywall in April 2011. To test whether our effects are robust, we also collect data for the LA Times, which set up a paywall in March 2012. Now, as we all know, many newspapers that are comparable to the New York Times and LA Times set up paywalls before or after that time frame. For example, the earliest popular newspaper out there, Wall Street Journal, set up a paywall back in 1997, where the whole idea of setting up paywalls was almost brand new and unheard of. The Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, USA Today, and New York Daily News, also major newspapers, set up paywalls well after our analysis period. In this way, our analysis window for the New York Times is unlikely to be influenced by paywall implementations by other major newspapers. So our research design involves tracking news consumption behaviors for the New York Times before and after its paywall rollout. We use several major national newspapers as benchmarks to compute the effect of New York Times paywall: Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, USA Today, Chicago Tribune, and New York Daily News. So why choose these specific newspapers? Because they are the most comparable to the New York Times with respect to circulation, and also rank among the top newspapers in the country, much like New York Times. More importantly, these newspapers did not differ from the New York Times with respect to the trends in readership before the New York Times set up its paywall, so they're actually comparable with the New York Times. On our data side, our online readership data are obtained from ComScore, that is one of the most reliable sources of online metrics. They source the data from a nationally representative online panel. We have monthly data from January 2010 through December 2013, although we contain our analysis to end at June 2013 to focus on a period where none of our controlled newspapers set up new paywalls in that time frame. For each of the newspapers, we track the number of unique visitors and three measures of engagement with the newspaper: the number of visits per month per visitor, pages accessed, and time spent on the website per visitor. On the print side, we collect data from the Alliance of Audited Media, which maintains audited circulation data for major newspapers. We collect circulation for New York Times, USA Today, and Wall Street Journal back from 2005 all the way to 2013 at the DMA level. Let me give you a brief overview of what we find. We find that the paywall brought in about 500,000 paying subscribers, digital subscribers within 2 years. So the New York Times witnessed subscription revenue gains, which is great. On the engagement side, while the paywall was responsible for a 11% loss of casual readers and 57% loss of heavy subscribers engagement, which can of course be worrisome, but at least we find that the loss in engagement on those who subscribe to the New York Times is less pronounced. So subscribing to the paywall can alleviate the loss in engagement reasonably. On the print side, we find that the paywall was responsible for between 1 and 4% increase in print readership for the New York Times, which is especially lucrative. Why? Any positive effect on print circulation is especially relevant to the newspaper industry because on average, a print reader brings about 16 times the advertising revenue as an online reader. To comment further on the source of the spillover effect, we examined the possible mechanisms. First, it could be that online readers are substituting to the print version because the online edition is no longer free because of the paywall, which means that the spillover would be driven by a substitution effect. Or the observed gains in print circulation could be because of the New York Times bundled pricing strategy, where they provided free online access to all print subscribers. Now, we find evidence in support of the latter explanation, so we find that bundling is more likely to have been the driver of the spillover effect. We perform a number of checks to rule out alternative explanations. The details of the tests are available in the paper, so I'm not going to bore you with all of them, but I want to point your attention to bullet point number 5, where we ask whether the paywall effect was likely a coincidence or something unique or specific to the New York Times. To test this, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things we do is we examine the effects of the paywall launched by a different newspaper in a different time period, the LA Times in March 2012. Overall, we find consistent effects for the LA Times as well as just as well. So the effects of the New York Times paywall are unlikely to have been driven by a coincidence or something specific to the New York Times. With this, I'm going to pass it back to Sriram to walk us through the managerial implications of our research.
Thanks a lot, Adi. So what do we take from the results that we laid out so far, Adi discussed so far? The first point is that paywalls actually lead to decrease in user engagement. So, and what we find in the paper is that this effect is probably a bit more pronounced for heavier users than for lighter users. And so as a result, an average New York Times web reader visits less often and stays on for a shorter duration after the paywall. But the good news, though, is that amongst people who subscribe to the paywall, the effect is, although it exists, it's more muted. It's less pronounced. So what does it mean? Losing heavy and loyal readers can actually deter generation of user-generated content and potentially have long-term consequences for newspapers. So although paywalls do sound very attractive in terms of being able to bring in revenue, this is something we need to be cognizant of moving forward. The second point, which the most interesting finding we think is the spillover effect of paywall. The fact that you actually put in a paywall in the online portal has some implications on print readership. In fact, we find that it has a positive effect in terms of driving up print readership in some way. So not only does this lead to higher revenues from just print circulation in terms of what users pay, but it can also have positive implications for print advertising, which as Adi pointed out, is significantly more lucrative than online advertising. we can step back and ask, does it have implications beyond the newspaper industry at all? So this idea of positive spillover effect speaks broadly to the impact of monetizing digital media on legacy platforms. And the last one is the paywalls. At least in this particular context, what you find is that as a net positive effect for newspapers, and they are probably here to stay. And this reflects a shift towards a more balanced monetization structure, and that's what we are seeing in terms of a lot of newspapers adopting this kind of pricing structure. I guess that is all we have, and I guess if you have questions, we'll be happy to answer them.
Great, thank you both. Excuse me, we now have time for questions from our participants. If you'd like to ask a question, remember you can just type your question in the Q&A tab, not the studio chat tab, and the audio box on your left. And we have one coming in. Here it is. What implications do your results have beyond the context of newspapers?
Well, that's a great question. One of the things that we kind of highlighted earlier is that the fact that if you charge users money for access to online content, it can have implications beyond that. It can have implications on your traditional traditional platforms. And if you are a platform with legacy platforms, you have to think about how do I bundle services so that they can help. So one implication I can think of is education. Right? As educational institutions are thinking about going online, the question is they also have legacy platforms like of the courses that we teach in the classroom. So how can we bundle these together? So you can think of having a bundle like what New York Times does, where anyone who gets a degree from a traditional university can also get free access to any online content that we create. That can have can be a way moving forward for educational institutions.
That's interesting. Let's see. We have another question. This one's a good one. What was the most surprising finding in your research?
The most surprising finding we saw was the spillover effect, as we talked about earlier. And going in, we had some idea that we would expect to see some decrease in online engagement, online number of unique visitors. But we were completely surprised by the fact that the paywalls had a positive effect on offline news consumption.
So you didn't anticipate that going in?
No, we did not. We were really surprised. And that's why I think on the implication we kind of laid out about bundling of online and offline kind of circles back to the point.
Right.
So just to quickly build on that, if you look at the overarching benefits that are discussed in the popular press industry reports, people say that they're expecting revenue gains online, and that seems to be the fundamental thrust behind looking at paywalls. But spillover effects is not necessarily expected. At least that's not the chief driver of paywall decision. That's not why newspapers actually launch paywalls. But at least in our view, it's a very nice positive after effect of digital monetization strategies that at least for this particular industry, it can be extremely rewarding because print advertising is, the rates they still favor the print medium, the legacy medium, which is heavily monetized on advertising at least.
Right. Great. Here is another one. What are the similarities and differences between content with paywall, and it just jumped on me just a second, between content with paywall and freemium? Do you need that
paywall,
again?
The paywall, as we discussed in this particular paper, is a freemium in the sense that if you want access up to 20 articles, it is free. If you need unlimited access, you have to pay for it. So the way it was structured in this particular case is a freemium model. You can also think of a walled garden where if you need access to any content, you have to pay for it. That could also be viewed as a paywall, but that is not a freemium because it's only accessible. There's no free content there.
Right. Okay. Another interesting question. Did you find the size of the New York Times as being a challenge or as a benefit for instituting a paywall? Could smaller outlets be more nimble in this area?
Adi, do you want to take that?
Sure, I can take a crack at that. So this is a good point, and ultimately, all the newspapers that we actually look at, investigate readership for, they're all they're predominantly national newspapers. They are of a certain size, of a certain popularity, and we see that paywalls have been successful for a bunch of these larger newspapers. Can we expect the exact same effects to hold for a much segmented niche player in the local market? That's unfortunately, we are limited by the scope of our data in this case, so it's not something we can authoritatively comment on given our data. But at least what we would expect is when we're looking for why people actually engage with an online newspaper, arguably it's because of the content offering. To the extent that I think the content offering for these local outlets that also have digital monetization strategies are commensurate with the paywall implementation, at least we would expect that the overall gains would follow along in the same direction, because we find very less substitution between the online edition and the print edition. But we find that there's more likely the case that New York Times actually benefited from the gains on the print side because of its unique and novel bundled pricing strategy. So I think, long story short, if we look at projecting the benefits on the spillover effect, I think it's heavily linked to New York Times bundled pricing strategy, to the extent that the local newspapers also have something similar going on. It wouldn't be a far stretch to imagine that they would see similar gains. Right.
I have another interesting question. This one's broader reaching. What is the role of news media going forward from your perspective?
Oh, this kind of goes back to the answer that Adi gave to the previous question. In a world where paying is going to be the norm, as I said, paywalls probably are going to be there in the future. And also in a world where people don't have to be constrained by geography to access news. They can access news from anywhere in the world to any of these portals. I think there is going to be a situation where a few portals are going to dominate, right? And those portals are going to be the ones that actually are going to create good quality content. So I think moving forward, news is going to be more quality-driven, where a few dominant portals that can actually invest in quality journalism are going to succeed. And as we know, journalism is an important aspect of keeping us all informed about what's going on in the world. And investing in quality journalism is what is going to keep these newspapers afloat moving forward.
Thanks.